In the dim, fog-shrouded hollow of Willow Creek, where the ancient oaks whispered secrets to the wind and the river ran black under moonless skies, lived Eleanor Hayes and her sons, Harlan and Harlan, the twins named after a grandfather long forgotten, as if one name could bind them eternally. They towered over the town like specters from some forgotten myth, each stretching 7 feet tall, their frames broad and unyielding, muscles forged not in gyms but in the relentless toil of the family farm that clung to the edge of decay. From birth, they had been inseparable, mirror images with eyes like polished obsidian, reflecting nothing but each other and the woman who had brought them into this world. Eleanor was a fragile beauty faded by years, her once vibrant hair now streaked with silver, her laughter a rare echo in the creaking house. Widowed young when a logging accident claimed her husband, she had raised the boys alone, pouring her soul into them until they became her world, her anchors in the isolation that swallowed their lives. The townsfolk murmured about the Hayes family, how the boys never strayed far from home, how Eleanor's gaze lingered too long on their hulking forms as they worked the fields shirtless under the sun. But whispers were just that, fleeting things lost in the mist. It began innocently enough, or so Eleanor told herself in the quiet hours before dawn. A shared meal by candlelight when the power flickered out during a storm, the boys' massive hands brushing hers as they passed the bread. Laughter that turned to lingering touches, shoulders pressed close against the chill. Harlan, the one with the faint scar above his brow from a childhood fall, would read to her from old books, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through her bones. The other Harlan, identical yet somehow sharper in his silences, would watch, his presence a shadow that both comforted and unnerved. As the seasons bled into one another, the boundaries softened like the earth after rain. Nights grew longer, the house's walls seeming to close in, trapping them in a web of unspoken yearnings. Eleanor felt the shift in her son's eyes, a hunger that mirrored the void left by her husband's death, but twisted into something profane. She pushed it away at first, burying it under layers of denial, but the twins were patient, their bond unbreakable, their desires a shared flame that burned brighter in the darkness. One autumn evening, as leaves rattled like bones against the windows, the first crack appeared. Harlan reached for her hand across the table, holding it longer than a son should, his thumb tracing circles on her skin. His brother nodded, a silent accord passing between them. Eleanor shivered, not from cold, but from the electric pulse that raced through her, a mix of terror and forbidden thrill. In that moment, the house felt alive, pulsing with secrets that would soon devour them all, pulling them into an abyss from which there was no return. From the moment they drew their first breath on a storm-lashed October night in 1987, Harlan and Harlan Hayes were wrong in ways no midwife dared speak aloud. The doctor who delivered them, an old man with trembling hands and a flask hidden in his coat, muttered that he had never seen twins so large, so perfectly mirrored, as though one soul had been violently split and forced into 2 colossal bodies. Each boy weighed nearly 12 pounds, their limbs already thick, their cries deep and resonant, shaking the walls of the cramped bedroom where Eleanor screamed through 20 hours of labor. When the second twin finally emerged, slick with blood and fury, he locked eyes with his brother across the cradle and did not cry again, only stared, as if recognition had passed between them before language existed. Eleanor, barely 23 and already widowed in her heart, her husband had vanished into the woods 3 weeks earlier, never to return, felt something shift inside her the instant she held them. They were too heavy for her fragile arms, their weight pressing her into the mattress like stones, yet she refused to let the nurse take them away. She cradled both against her chest, their mouths seeking hungrily, and in that raw, animal moment she sensed the bond forming, not the gentle tether of ordinary motherhood, but something denser, more possessive. Their tiny fists clutched at her skin with surprising strength, nails digging half-moons into her breasts as they nursed in perfect unison, heads turning in identical arcs, eyes never leaving her face. As months became years, the strangeness deepened. The twins refused separate cribs, screaming until they were placed side by side, limbs entangled even in sleep. They learned to walk on the same day, each gripping one of Eleanor's hands, their steps synchronized so perfectly that neighbors swore they moved as a single creature wearing 2 skins. By age 5 they had outgrown children twice their age, towering over the kindergarten teacher who quit after a week, claiming their silent stares made her skin crawl. At home they spoke little to anyone else, but with Eleanor their voices were soft, intimate, a private language of murmurs and touches that excluded the world. She told herself it was love, pure, fierce, protective love, but in the quiet hours after they fell asleep against her, their massive childish bodies draped across her lap like wolves guarding a kill, she felt the first cold thread of dread weave through her heart. They were hers alone, and they knew it. And in the dark, when their breathing settled into the same slow rhythm, she sometimes caught them watching her with eyes too old for children, eyes that already understood ownership. By the time the twins reached 14, the Hayes farm had become a place the world quietly forgot. The dirt road that once carried neighbors' trucks to borrow tools or drop off casseroles grew over with briars and goldenrod until only a faint scar remained through the weeds. Harlan and Harlan, now 6'6" and still climbing, took to patrolling the property line at dusk, their silhouettes black against the fading sky, axes slung over shoulders that strained the seams of their flannel shirts. Anyone foolish enough to wander close heard the low warning growl of their voices long before they saw the glint of steel. Inside the house, doors that had once stood open to summer breezes were bolted year-round. The twins nailed heavy quilts over every window on the ground floor, claiming the sunlight bleached the furniture, but Eleanor knew better. They didn't want eyes looking in any more than they wanted her looking out. Mail went uncollected until the postman simply stopped coming. Groceries arrived in crates the boys hauled from town in the rusted pickup, refusing help, refusing conversation, their massive frames filling doorways like living barriers. Eleanor's friends dwindled first. Telephone calls went unanswered until the women stopped trying. When someone knocked, the twins answered together, filling the frame shoulder to shoulder, identical faces blank and cold. After a while, even the church ladies gave up, whispering that poor Eleanor Hayes had been swallowed whole by those strange giant boys of hers. The preacher came once, Bible in hand, determined to save a soul he feared was slipping. He left pale and trembling, never speaking of what the twins had said or hadn't said while standing over him in the shadowed hallway. At night the three of them sat by the kitchen fire in a silence that felt almost sacred. The twins had taken to carving things, grotesque little figures from oak and bone, while Eleanor darned socks that grew ever larger to fit their impossible feet. Conversation was sparse, but every word carried weight, every glance lingered. When she rose to refill their coffee, one brother's hand would settle at the small of her back, guiding, claiming space. The other watched, unblinking, as though memorizing the curve of her waist beneath the worn cotton dress. Outside, the farm decayed in perfect quiet. Barn roofs sagged, fences leaned drunkenly, thistles choked the vegetable rows she once tended. The world narrowed to the circle of firelight, to the creak of chairs built specially to bear their weight, to the steady rhythm of three hearts learning to beat as one. And still the twins grew, upward and inward, sealing the house, sealing their mother, sealing themselves into a kingdom of three where no outsider would ever again be suffered to breathe. The winter Eleanor turned 39, the silence in the house thickened into something almost viscous. Snow piled against the quilt-covered windows until the rooms glowed faint green from the light filtering through ice, and the only sounds were the crackle of the wood stove and the slow, deliberate movements of her sons. They were 16 now, broader than the doorway to the parlor, their voices dropped so low that a single murmured sentence seemed to settle on the furniture like dust. She had always talked to them, too much, perhaps, pouring out the loneliness that had lived in her chest since the day her husband walked into the woods and never walked out. At first it had been ordinary maternal confession, how tired she was, how the bills stacked higher than the firewood, how sometimes she woke gasping from dreams of being buried alive. The twins listened without interrupting, heads tilted at the same exact angle, absorbing every tremor in her voice the way parched earth drinks rain. But the nature of the telling changed. Late at night, when the cold pressed so hard against the house that the timbers groaned, she found herself speaking of things no mother should name. How her skin felt too tight after years of sleeping alone. How she sometimes stood under the shower just to feel water running over places no hand had touched since their father vanished. She would laugh, brittle and embarrassed, expecting them to look away. They never did. Their eyes, black, unreadable, stayed fixed on her face, drinking in the flush that rose to her throat when she realized what she had admitted. One night the confession slipped its leash entirely. She sat between them on the threadbare sofa, wrapped in a quilt that barely covered their three bodies, and told them about the ache that lived low in her belly, the one that flared whenever she caught them watching her bend over the stove or stretch to hang laundry on the line. The words came out ragged, half apology, half plea. She waited for horror, for disgust, for the shattering of the only love she had left. Instead, Harlan, the one with the scar, lifted her hand and pressed it flat against his chest, letting her feel the thunder of his heart. The other Harlan leaned in until she felt the heat of him along her entire side, his breath stirring the fine hairs at her temple. Neither spoke. They simply held her there, pinned by tenderness and weight and silence, until the shame melted into something warmer, heavier, more dangerous. From that night on, the space between confession and touch grew smaller with every shared secret, every lingering glance, every moment she let herself rest her head against a shoulder that belonged to her own flesh and blood. The spring Eleanor turned 41, the bank took the last of what mattered. A thin man in a cheap suit drove up the overgrown track with papers that said the farm, her husband's blood-soaked legacy, the only ground she had ever stood on, now belonged to strangers unless she paid what she could never pay. She sat at the kitchen table staring at the numbers until they blurred, the notice trembling in hands that had once rocked two infants who now loomed behind her like living monoliths. Harlan and Harlan read the letter over her shoulders without asking permission. Their shadows swallowed the table whole. She felt the moment they understood, the same instant, the same sharp intake of breath through identical lungs. When she began to cry, quiet, hopeless tears that tasted of every year she had kept this place alive alone, the scarred Harlan knelt, folding her into the vast cage of his arms. The other pressed against her back, a wall of heat and muscle, until she was enclosed between them, the papers crushed unseen beneath one enormous palm. That night they carried the kitchen table out to the yard and burned it, along with every overdue notice, every tax demand, every scrap of the world's claim on them. Flames leapt high enough to paint the clouds orange, and the three of them stood in the circle of firelight, wind whipping their hair, while the twins' faces hardened into something older than their 17 years. They did not speak of money again. Instead, they spoke of staying. Of keeping her safe. Of never letting anyone take what was theirs. Work began at dawn the next day. They tore down the rotting fences and built new ones taller, thicker, topped with rusted barbed wire scavenged from abandoned farms. They felled trees at the edge of the property and dragged the trunks across the road until the way in was blocked by a barricade no vehicle could pass. When the bankman returned with a sheriff's deputy, the twins met them at the gate, bare-chested despite the cold, axes resting easy on their shoulders. Nothing was said that the visitors cared to repeat, but the car reversed so fast it left rubber on the dirt and never came back. Inside the house, Eleanor's fear slowly transmuted into a feverish gratitude that tasted like worship. Her sons moved through the rooms like guardian titans, repairing what decades had broken, their hands gentle only when they touched her. They carried her over muddy patches in the yard so her feet stayed clean. They bathed the chill from her skin with water they heated on the stove when the pipes froze. And every night they drew closer, flanking her on the narrow bed that had once been hers alone, their massive bodies forming a living fortress around her fragile one, whispering the same promise in stereo, "No one will ever take you from us, Mama." No one. The summer they turned 18, the air in the house turned thick as molasses, sweet and cloying and impossible to breathe without tasting what was coming. Nights were the worst. After the chores were done and the moon hung bloated over the sealed-up farm, the twins would sit on the back porch steps, shirtless, sweat carving pale rivers down spines that looked carved from oak. They spoke little to anyone else now, but to each other they spoke constantly, voices pitched so low the crickets seemed loud by comparison. It began with a single sentence, barely audible above the drone of cicadas. Scarred Harlan said it first, staring at the dark line of trees where the world used to end. "She smells different when she's lonely." The other Harlan didn't answer right away. He dragged a thumb across his lower lip, slow, thoughtful, then nodded once. That nod was all it took. From that moment, the desire had a name, and names make things real. They started testing it in small ways, the way children prod a bruise to see how deep the pain goes. One would lean too close when passing her the salt, letting his chest brush the back of her neck. The other would stand behind her at the sink, hands resting on the counter so she was caged without being touched, breathing her in like smoke. They watched her pupils flare, watched the pulse leap at her throat, and later, under the single lantern in the barn, they compared notes the way other boys might trade baseball cards. "She trembles when I say her name slow," one murmured. "She leans into it when I don't say anything at all," the other replied. They laughed then, a low shared rumble that shook dust from the rafters, because the discovery was perfect. They wanted the same thing, the exact same thing, down to the rhythm of breath and the angle of hip. There was no rivalry, only amplification. 2 mouths, 4 hands, one hunger sharpened to a single flawless edge. Some nights they lay on the barn floor side by side, staring up at cobwebbed beams while thunder rolled far off, and spoke of her in the present tense as if she were already theirs. How soft her waist had become under the worn cotton. How her mouth opened just enough when she dreamed. How no one else would ever know the sounds she could be taught to make. Each confession fed the other until the wanting was a living thing pacing between them, fur bristling, eyes glowing. By August the air itself seemed to vibrate with it. When Eleanor stepped outside to hang laundry, she felt their gaze like brands on her skin. When she bent to pull weeds, she knew they were counting the vertebrae visible beneath her dress. And still they waited, patient as stones wearing down a riverbed, certain the current would bring her to them. Because now the desire was sanctified by agreement, baptized in twin voices whispering the same forbidden scripture. She is ours, she has always been ours, and soon she will understand there is no door out of this house that does not lead deeper in. The night it broke open was late September. The air so still the candle flames stood straight as fence posts. Eleanor had fallen asleep on the sofa again, exhausted from canning tomatoes, her head tipped back against the armrest, one thin strap of her slip fallen from a shoulder pale as milk in the lamplight. The twins had come in from the barn smelling of hay and sweat, paused in the doorway, and simply looked at her for a long, suspended moment. Scarred Harlan moved first. He crossed the room in 3 silent strides and knelt, the floorboards groaning under his weight. His hand, large enough to span her entire ribcage, settled on her collarbone with the reverence of a priest touching an altar. He traced the fallen strap with one calloused thumb, then bent and pressed his mouth to the hollow of her throat. It was not a kiss so much as a tasting, slow and deliberate, the way a man tests the ripeness of fruit he intends to devour. Eleanor stirred, murmured something wordless, but did not wake. Her body, traitorous, arched the smallest degree into the heat. Behind him, the other Harlan stood frozen, breath caught so hard his chest hurt. The sight of his brother's lips on their mother's skin struck him like a blade between the ribs, sharp, bright, unbearable. Jealousy flared white-hot, not because he wanted her alone, but because for one shattering instant he had been left outside the moment. He made a sound, low, animal, involuntary, and the scarred twin lifted his head, eyes glittering with something between triumph and apology. Then understanding passed between them without words, the way lightning jumps from cloud to cloud. Scarred Harlan shifted aside, just enough, and the second brother dropped to his knees on her other side. He took her wrist, turned it palm up, and pressed his mouth to the thin blue veins there, teeth grazing delicate skin. Eleanor's eyes fluttered open at last, hazy with sleep and candlelight, meeting first one son's gaze and then the other. Confusion flickered, then recognition, then something darker that made her lips part on a breath that was half gasp, half prayer. They did not speak. They did not need to. Each felt the jealousy transmute into something fiercer, a shared possession so absolute it burned away every remnant of separate desire. 2 mouths now moved over her, one at her throat, one at her wrist, for hands mapping the places they had only watched from shadows. When she trembled, they steadied her together. When her back arched again, higher this time, they answered in perfect, mirrored motion. In that moment the balance tipped forever. What had been fantasy spoken in barn darkness became flesh and heat and salt. The accidental intimacy was no accident at all, it was the door swinging wide, and neither brother would ever again stand on the wrong side of it. The first man to die was a traveling seed salesman who knocked one October afternoon, his smile too wide, his eyes lingering on Eleanor as she stood behind her sons in the doorway. He spoke of hybrid corn and easy credit, voice smooth as axle grease, and when the twins said they weren't interested he laughed and told Eleanor she deserved better than living buried out here with 2 mute giants. That night his car was found nose down in the river, windows smashed, pockets turned out, body never recovered. Folks blamed the slick roads after rain. After that, the pattern repeated with the quiet inevitability of seasons. A widowed deacon from the church came calling with a casserole and a marriage proposal tucked under pious words, 2 days later search parties dragged the quarry and found only his hat floating like a lily pad. A county assessor arrived to revalue the land now that taxes were years in arrears, his clipboard washed up weeks later, pages swollen blank. Each time the twins returned from wherever they had been, mud on their boots, a faint metallic smell under the lye soap, they bathed Eleanor with water heated on the stove, hands gentle as they scrubbed her back, her arms, the places strangers had looked. They never spoke the names of the missing. They simply dried her with towels warmed by the fire and laid her between them, bodies forming a living barricade against the world that kept trying to take her away. Sometimes a sheriff's cruiser idled at the end of the blocked drive, lights painting the trees red and blue. The twins would stand on the porch shoulder to shoulder, still as statues carved from night itself, until the deputy grew uneasy and left. Once, a bolder one walked the perimeter with a flashlight. The beam found 2 sets of footprints leading into the woods and none coming back. After that the patrols stopped. Inside the house the air grew heavier, scented with lye and wood smoke and something coppersweet that clung to their skin no matter how they scrubbed. Eleanor began to flinch at sudden noises, but the flinch always melted when one of the twins touched her, a palm against the nape of her neck, a thumb stroking the inside of her wrist, reminding her whose hands were safe. They kept her fed, kept her warm, kept her dressed in soft flannel shirts that had once been theirs and now hung to her knees like robes of ownership. By the 3rd winter no one came anymore. The road stayed barricaded, the telephone wires sagged unbroken and silent, the mailbox rusted shut. And still the twins walked the boundaries every dusk, axes across their shoulders, eyes scanning for any new set of tracks that dared approach what belonged to them. They moved in perfect synchrony, 2 shadows stitched together by moonlight, leaving nothing behind but rumors and empty boots filling slowly with snow. The night she finally surrendered was not marked by thunder or blood, only by the soft, relentless click of the clock in the hallway and the way the kerosene lamp hissed when the scarred Harlan trimmed the wick lower. Eleanor stood in the kitchen doorway wrapped in one of their old shirts, sleeves rolled a dozen times, hem brushing mid-thigh, and watched them come in from the cold. Snow melted from their hair in perfect twin rivulets, tracing the same paths down thick necks and disappearing beneath collars. They did not speak, they never needed to anymore. The air itself carried the question they had been asking with their eyes for months. She had tried to hold the line. Had slept with the bedroom door barred by a chair that looked like a child's toy beneath their fists. Had prayed in a whisper that tasted of rust. Had told herself that the ache low in her belly was only loneliness, only hunger, only the devil quoting scripture. But every night they waited outside her door, patient as winter, breathing slow and steady until her own breath matched theirs and the chair seemed foolish. Every morning she woke to find small offerings on the threshold, a sprig of cedar, a polished river stone, once a single perfect apple sliced open to reveal a heart-shaped core of seeds. Tokens that said the same thing in the same silent tongue, we are already inside. Tonight the resistance simply crumbled, the way frost flowers dissolve under the first warm rain. She took one step forward, then another, until she stood between them in the narrow kitchen. The scarred twin lifted a hand and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek with the same tenderness he once used to lift her over puddles. The other circled behind, palms settling on her hips as if they had always belonged there. When she shivered, it was not from fear. They undressed her slowly, reverently, the way men unwrap something sacred they have coveted for years. Buttons slipped free under fingers that could snap bone. Fabric whispered to the floor. Candlelight painted gold across collarbones and the soft inner curve of thighs that had never known another touch since birthing them. She closed her eyes so she would not have to see how eagerly her body answered, how her back arched when 2 mouths found her throat at once, how her knees parted under the pressure of 4 massive hands that knew exactly where to press. There was no violence, not yet. Only a terrible, exquisite gentleness that felt worse than force, because it left her no excuse. When they lifted her onto the table, old oak scarred by decades of family meals, she went willingly, legs wrapping around identical waists as if her body had rehearsed this moment in dreams she refused to remember. The first slow press inside her drew a sound from her throat she did not recognize, half sob, half hymn. And then there were 2 of them, seamless, relentless, sharing her breath, her pulse, her ruin with the same perfect rhythm they had shared everything else. Afterward, They carried her to the bed that was now theirs and curled around her like bookends around a single fragile volume, whispering the same word against her skin until it lost all meaning and became only the shape of their mouths. Memar, Memar, Memar. The gentleness lasted exactly as long as it took them to understand she would not leave. Once that certainty settled in their bones like winter frost, the hands that had once trembled with reverence grew bold, then careless, then cruel. They were 7 feet of hard-earned muscle apiece, and Eleanor weighed less than the feed sacks they tossed one-handed into the loft. The difference had always been there, but now they let her feel it. It started with small corrections. A wrist pinned too hard when she reached for the doorknob, just to remind her the door stayed locked. A palm pressed between her shoulder blades when she bent to stir the pot, holding her there until her breath fogged the stove window and her spine sang with the strain. They never raised their voices. The quiet was worse. A single murmured "Stay still, Mama," while one brother held her hips exactly where he wanted them and the other took his turn from behind, slow and deliberate, watching her face in the cracked mirror above the dresser to see how wide her eyes could get. They learned her body the way they had once learned the farm's every fence line and weather sign, by testing limits until something broke. How deep a bruise could bloom on the inside of her thigh before she cried out. How many minutes they could keep her on the edge, thighs trembling, begging in a voice shredded raw, before mercy felt like another form of control. They marked her in places clothes would hide, finger-shaped blooms across her throat, teeth prints on the soft underside of her breasts, the perfect outline of a belt buckle high on the back of her leg where no one but them would ever see. Some nights they took her together, one in front and one behind, moving in that terrible synchrony until she forgot whose hands were whose, until the world narrowed to the stretch and burn and the wet slap of skin on skin. Other nights they made her choose which brother she knelt for first, laughing softly when her tears fell on their boots because choosing felt like betrayal either way. They never struck her face. Her face was still the one they had loved first, the one they kissed with a tenderness that made the rest worse. Afterward they bathed her themselves, huge hands careful again, washing away blood and seed and the evidence of whatever new threshold they had crossed. They wrapped her in quilts, fed her spoonfuls of soup from the same bowl, stroked her hair until she slept wedged between them, unable to move without touching one or the other. In the dark their breathing settled into the same slow cadence, and she understood the final truth. The cage was not the house, not the barricaded road, not even the bruises flowering beneath her skin. The cage was the way they loved her, completely, exclusively, irrevocably, until pain and comfort and terror and pleasure were braided so tightly she could no longer tell which thread, if pulled, would unravel her completely. By the winter of their 22nd year, the town had learned to speak the name Hayes only in lowered voices, the way people once spoke of plague. Children dared each other to stand at the edge of the woods and count to 10 before running. Teenagers parked at the barricade with headlights off, hoping for a glimpse of the giants who swallowed men whole. Someone spray-painted Devil's Door on the fallen log that blocked the drive. Someone else nailed a crude cross to it. Neither stayed long. Inside, Eleanor moved like a ghost through rooms that smelled of sex and lie and wood smoke. Her hair had gone white at the temples almost overnight, her collarbones stood sharp beneath skin mapped with fading violet and fresh crimson. She no longer flinched when a hand closed around her wrist, flinching required energy she no longer possessed. She simply let herself be steered, to the table, to the bed, to the bath, to the narrow space between two bodies that had once been her babies and were now her entire horizon. The first real crack came from an outsider who refused to stay frightened. Deputy Rollins, young, new to the badge, and still believing in justice, drove a bulldozer up the frozen track one February morning. He had a warrant and a conscience and a radio crackling with state police on standby. The twins watched from the porch, bare-chested despite the wind that cut like wire, axes resting easy across their shoulders. When Rollins stepped down from the cab and shouted Eleanor's name, something inside her stirred, a flicker of the woman who had once sung hymns in the front pew, who had kissed scraped knees and dreamed of grandchildren. She appeared in the doorway behind them, wrapped in a quilt the color of dried blood, eyes sunken but alive. For one heartbeat she met Rollins' gaze across the yard. For one heartbeat the twins felt her weight shift, the tiniest lean toward the light. Scarred Harlan's hand shot out and closed around her throat from behind, thumb pressing the exact spot that made her vision spark black at the edges. The other brother never looked away from the deputy, but his knuckles went white on the axe handle. Rollins raised his radio. The twins moved at the same instant, two blurs of motion too fast for anything human. The bulldozer's windshield starred with thrown steel. The deputy's scream cut short. Snow began to fall in thick, deliberate flakes, erasing footprints, erasing everything. Later, when the state police finally came in force, helicopters, floodlights, dogs baying through the trees, they found the house empty, the fire still warm, the bed still rumpled and damp. In the kitchen they found Eleanor's quilt soaked red and pinned to the table with a carving knife through the center. On the wall above it, written in something darker than paint, were two words repeated over and over until the plaster wept. Mama ours, mama ours. Tracks led into the forest, 3 sets, one small and dragging between 2 impossibly large, and then nothing. The dogs refused to follow. The snow kept falling. And somewhere deep in the hollow where the river runs black and the oaks still whisper, the Hayes family walked on, bound tighter than ever, carrying their kingdom of 3 into a darkness no light would ever reach again.